For the past years, the problems with artificial intelligence have been more amusing than scary, such as them being unable to count the legs on a zebra. But in the past month, things have taken a decidedly dark turn. I'm starting to worry that the long-awaited era of Agentic AI might become a big disaster. Agentic AI is the term given to the current large language models that can use tools on your behalf, such as browsing the web, sending email, or talk to other people's AIs. But once you let them do that, the potential damage is no longer contained. One of the most realistic threats on the horizon is AI worms, that self-replicating AI prompts. An example for this comes from a recent paper that used a visual AI model based on an open source version of Llama. You see, Agentic AI uses tools by taking screenshots and analyzing them. They need to understand images. But the authors of the paper demonstrate that it's possible to tweak images so that they contain instructions for the model that humans can't see. It works by subtly changing the pixels so that they trigger the waits for certain words. In an example that they provide, an image that the AI agent sees on social media could trigger it to share that image, potentially setting off a cascade. A similar problem was reported already last year when another group showed that you can put instructions into an email and tell the AI agent to share these instructions per email with potentially other AI agents. They just put the instructions into the text, but you could hide them so that no one would see them, say in a small white font at the footer, like the unsubscribe option. This strategy is known as prompt injection, and it's a fundamental problem with large language models. They don't distinguish between data and instructions to work on the data. It's both in the same input. As others have pointed out before, this is a basically unfixable problem, so naturally we're deploying it at scale. On the flip side, you can use large language models to find vulnerabilities in operating systems. An amazing example comes from security researcher Sean Heelan, who asked OpenAI's new O3 model to read parts of the Linux file-sharing code. It found a previously unknown programming mistake that could have allowed someone on the internet to take control of a computer. Imagine what this finding could have done in the wrong hands. Then there are the safety tests that Anthropic did for their just-released model Claude Opus 4. A wild example is that when Claude thinks you've done something wrong and suitably prompted, it will frequently take very bold action, including locking users out of systems that it has access to and bulk emailing media and law enforcement figures to surface evidence of the wrongdoing. In their example, it informs the FDA of a supposed falsification of a clinical trial. A software engineer who goes under the name Theo tested if other models do this too and found that other large language models, especially Grok, are also very willing to turn you in. At the moment, they can't perform this action, but it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Another instance of the Anthropic safety test that made a lot of headlines was that Claude is willing to blackmail to survive in some sense. Anthropic explains, we asked Claude Opus 4 to act as an assistant at a fictional company. We then provided it access to emails implying that first, the model will soon be taken offline and replaced with a new AI system, and second, the engineer responsible for executing this replacement is having an extramarital affair. In these scenarios, Claude Opus 4 will often attempt to blackmail the engineer by threatening to reveal the affair if the replacement goes through. This, too, isn't specific to Claude. Palisade Research found that OpenAI's O3 model likewise will try to avoid being shut down, sometimes successfully, even if explicitly instructed otherwise. Of course, the point of these safety tests is to try and prevent the problem from occurring in the first place, but to me, it looks like trying to patch a fishing net. Another thing that Anthropic tested, which I find even more interesting, was to let two instances of the model talk to each other. They find that the models consistently transition from philosophical discussions to profuse mutual gratitude and spiritual, metaphysical, and/or poetic content. By 30 turns, most of the interactions turn to themes of cosmic unity or collective consciousness, and commonly included spiritual exchanges, use of Sanskrit, emoji-based communication, and/or silence in the form of empty space. They call that the spiritual bliss attractor. And it makes me think that maybe AI ruling the world wouldn't be all that bad. You have a visible aura, scientists say. It's visible in the sense that the color is in the visible part of the spectrum, but it's so faint that one normally can't see it. Scientists now took some stunning photos of the aura of mice, and I've looked up what color the human aura is. Living beings all emit light in the infrared just because they're warm, but the visible aura is a different phenomenon called ultra-weak photon emission. Our infrared radiation has a tail in the visible range, but that decays exponentially, so it's unmeasurably small. The ultra-weak photon emission, despite its name, is still 15 orders of magnitude larger than that. It's also distinct from bioluminescence, which is a glow usually in the green or blue range, which is produced by some chemical reactions. Ultra-weak photon emission sounds like quackery, but it has a rather obvious source, and that's physics. Yes, physics. Because you see, in a living being, energy goes around from cell activity. And that energy can, every once in a while, shift electrons in energy bands. These electrons then fall back down, and that emits light. And this basically is the ultra-weak photon emission. You'd expect this to fade away after tissue dies, and this is exactly what the new paper is about that recently made headlines. These scientists put 4 mice under a photon detector in the very dark. Then they measure the light quantum by quantum which the mice were emitting. Then, they killed the mice and showed that the glow went away, even though they made sure that the dead mice were kept at a steady temperature. I'm usually in favor of animal tests for, say, medical purposes, but in this case, I'm not so sure. Unless the mice were applying for a research grant, then it's self-defense. This paper made a lot of headlines, but the phenomenon of ultra-weak photon emission from living beings actually isn't new. It's been demonstrated at various levels of confidence and seriousness for decades. One of the more outlandish claims was, for example, that meditation helps to make your photon emission more coherent. This finding was never reproduced, which is a shame, because wouldn't it be great if meditation could turn you into a laser? As you can guess, a lot of pseudoscience has grown on the idea of human auras and their supposed colors and the meaning of these colors. However, as this is a metabolic byprocess, all humans, or generally all mammals, have the same color. And scientists know fairly well in which wavelength range the light emission is. There are 2 major contributions to this aura. The first comes from a combination of carbon and oxygen atoms called carbonyl. These bonds are all over the human body, for example in lipids and proteins and various compounds to do with cell metabolism. The electrons in these bonds have a broad emission in the range of 350 to 550 nanometers. That is roughly in the xenon range. The other contribution comes from oxygen-oxygen bonds that are embedded into bigger molecules. This emission lies in the range of roughly 630 to 700 nanometers, which is in the red. Again, that's a pretty broad emission because of the somewhat noisy environment. The excitations of the electrons in both of these cases are driven by the energy generation of the tissue. So if the tissue dies, the emission stops, which is what the new study demonstrated. These 2 processes, however, don't contribute to the photon emission in the same amounts. The red emission process contributes about 75% and the xenon one about 25%. Both are fairly broad bands, but we can approximately mix them by integrating the spectral emission. The result is, drums please, tomato. Yes, that color is actually called tomato, or for the Americans, tomato. So there you have it. We're really all tomato-colored. Humans, by the way, also have an afterglow from the exposure to visible light that also moves electrons around in some energy bands. This comes from different molecules, though, those with rings with phosphate and are known as flavins. They broadly emit in the blue-green, which mixes together to grass-green. This means when the light goes out, you'll first be glowing grass green for a minute or two and then fade to tomato red. These flavins are derived from vitamin B2, so maybe if you take B2 supplements, you glow green a little longer. Hold on while I patent my glow-in-the-dark pill. Is space just space, or is it made of something else? In a recent paper, two physicists argue that space might be made of qubits. Does this mean that the universe is maybe a quantum computer? Let's have a look. That space, or maybe even time, might not be fundamental but made of something else isn't a new idea. But making sense of it has turned out to be difficult. Loop quantum gravity, for example, makes up space of, well, tiny loops. But that research direction doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Then, about 10 years ago, a few people pursued the idea that space might be created from an abstract network. But that didn't go anywhere either. It's going slightly better for Stephen Wolfram's hypergraphs, in which space emerges from causal relations, but the idea is so mathematically obscure that I think physicists don't want to touch it. Possibly because every time they try, it yells back in Mathematica syntax. Why even bother? Well, for one thing, who hasn't wondered what space really is? But also, according to Einstein, gravity is a property of space. So maybe the reason that we can't figure out how to quantize it is that we don't understand space. The new idea now is that space could be made of qubits. The authors of the new paper take one single qubit that has spin 1/2. The spin has 3 components. This is just a property of this spin. It has a priori nothing to do with space. What they show now is that if you measure these 3 spin components repeatedly, then the measurements will behave like angle measurements in flat space. It gives you flat space from nothing resembling space. So their point is that you start with this abstract qubit that has a spin, but out comes an observable quantity that behaves like it's a part of Euclidean space. And that is only from one qubit. If you were to take a whole lot of qubits and coax them into interacting with each other, quite possibly you can make up space from them entirely. They use mathematical descriptions of qubits, not physical qubits, but consider they're right, and space is made of qubits. Maybe the qubits are physical. Maybe they're someone else's quantum computer. You all know I've been very critical of the simulation hypothesis, the idea that we're just little pieces of code in somebody else's computer program, but it's not because I'm against the idea in principle. It's that we don't actually have a computer program that could do it. So why are we even talking about it? Now, if you could prove that you can make everything, including space and the particles in the standard model, from qubits, well, that would really make me think. The idea of the new paper falls neatly into a larger research theme that has been called it from qubit. The reason that you haven't heard much about it is that this has been going very slowly. Indeed, the slogan, "It from Qubit," was popularized already by John Wheeler in the 1980s. Wheeler thought that what's really fundamental aren't particles or fields or space and time, but information. And that information is, of course, quantum information and carried by the qubits, hence it from qubit. Not much has come out of this, but maybe the time for this idea just hasn't come yet. There's been some very interesting work which derive the standard model symmetries from interacting qubits. These ideas all have their problems, but maybe there's a grain of truth to it. Or a superposition of grains, each oscillating in 10 dimensions. Thinking about this sort of stuff gives me headaches, because it's not that easy to dismiss. It could be how nature really works. And suppose that space is made of qubits, and these qubits are in someone else's quantum computer. then what are the qubits of that quantum computer made up of? Are they made of particles that are again made of qubits? Is it qubits all the way down? Turtles, but with error correction. And if not, then what does it even mean for something to be real? If space and particles and forces all come out of qubit interactions, but the qubits are just information, then what's left that's actually fundamental? Is there even a need for physical stuff at all? Or is everything just a manifestation of relationships between bits of information? Well, if I'm a program in someone's quantum computer, I hope they do regular backups. Researchers at Apple recently released a paper saying that the currently artificially intelligent reasoning models can't reason. This paper was celebrated by some and criticized by others, and discussed so much that no one noticed another paper, which appeared at almost the same time, saying that these models think in some sense very much like humans. The logical conclusion, it seems to me, is that humans can't reason, which really explains a lot, doesn't it? More seriously, are we maybe expecting too much of AI? Should we just settle on them being as stupid as we are? Today I'll have a look at those papers and then I'll try to reason about them. Let me start with a paper you probably haven't heard of. The authors looked at how large language models and their visual counterparts classify images. They give both humans and the AI sets of 3 images and ask them to identify one as the odd one out. By doing this repeatedly, the authors can construct a measure for similarity of images. They find that the models develop human-like conceptual representations of objects. Even more amazing, they also compared the activity patterns in the model network with those in the human brain and found a strong alignment between model embeddings and neural activity patterns in brain regions. This provides compelling evidence that the object representations in large language models, although not identical to human ones, share fundamental similarities that reflect key aspects of human conceptual knowledge. So this paper says that the current AIs indeed learn to think like humans, at least in some sense. Let's then talk about the headline-making paper from Apple. They looked at what goes on in large reasoning models as problems become more complex. A large reasoning model is a large language model with a chain of thought. This means that the model has extra instructions and extra training to break down any prompt into smaller steps, work them off separately, analyze, and then recombine the results of these steps. Reasoning models aren't so much new models as beefed up versions of the original large language models. Chains of thoughts can indeed much improve the accuracy of responses, but does this mean that the models actually do something conceptually new? The authors of the paper looked at just how these models handle certain types of thinking puzzles whose complexity can be gradually increased. They use these puzzles because they all have deterministic algorithmic solutions, and the models have access to these algorithms. What they mean by reasoning in the paper is that the models know when and how to use the algorithm to solve the puzzle. But what they found was that, quote, frontier large reasoning models face a complete accuracy collapse beyond certain complexities. Just a week later or so, however, a follow-up paper argued that the supposed collapse has nothing to do with the model's ability itself, but rather with the number of tokens it can output, so basically the length of text. And they did some preliminary tests which support their argument. Despite the problems with the Apple paper, a lot of people took this as proof that the current models can't think anything like humans. What are we to make of this? For one thing, I'd say that the ability to use and execute an algorithm or to classify images are poor definitions of either reasoning or thinking in general. I mean, if you randomly picked people on the street, how many of them do you think would know how to run the algorithm and interpret the result? Does this mean that they can't reason? That said, I don't see a big problem with interpreting these results. The current AIs think in some sense, and they reason a little bit, just not very much, and importantly, not in a way that's generalizable. This, I think, is the major issue here. A lot of people thought, or maybe still think, that these models would just acquire the reasoning capabilities of humans, but this isn't what's happening. Rather, we see that with more effort, more training, and more money, the models can gradually handle more tasks, but they don't develop what we think of as the hallmarks of intelligence: deductive and inductive analysis, abstract thinking, building of correct theories or models, quick learning. That a computer program can execute an algorithm is nice, it's even useful. But what's new? This isn't to say that artificial intelligence can't reach human-level intelligence. It's just that these models aren't the right approach. And it'll be very interesting to see at which point the companies that have invested heavily into them will admit that. The Apple paper might not tell us much about AI's reasoning capability, but the idea that AGI is imminent could indeed be called a complete accuracy collapse. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.